But, you know, to put it all into one word, it'd have to be just like genius.
It's March 1995. On a stage in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, the British rock band The Cult is coming apart at the seams. The tour is called Black Rain, but it feels more like a black cloud has settled over the group for good. After the show, dates are scrapped, the band dissolves, and frontman Ian Astbury basically vanishes from the project he'd led for over a decade. Guitarist Billy Duffy would later say with blunt simplicity, "We broke up in 1995. That was a real breakup. We were in South America and Ian just split." So what pushes a globally successful rock band to this point? To a place where two guys at its core, Ian Astbury and Billy Duffy, who had weathered the 80s and conquered arenas, couldn't even finish a tour? Well, the answer isn't a single fight, but it's a calculated gamble. A musical pivot so drastic and so badly timed that it stopped one of rock's most dynamic forces dead in its tracks. It was a single, self-titled album released just 5 months earlier that acted as a catalyst for the band's total collapse. This is a story of how The Cult, in a desperate attempt to stay relevant, created the very album that would make them disappear for years. Before we get started, be sure to hit the bell notification icon and put all notifications on. I hear from a lot of my subscribers that they don't even get notifications when I post my videos. I would greatly appreciate if you guys did that. By 1994, the music world was a very different planet than the one The Cult had conquered just a few years earlier. The swaggering, leather-clad, riff-heavy rock of their smash albums Electric and Sonic Temple suddenly felt like a relic. The late 80s had been their kingdom, but their early 90s really belonged to a new kind of royalty. Grunge had washed over the mainstream from Seattle, bringing with it a wave of flannel shirts, brooding introspection, and a genuine disdain for the peacock rock stars of the last decade. Bands like Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Pearl Jam had rewritten the rules, and across the Atlantic, the swagger of Britpop was bubbling up with Oasis and Blur. The Cult was caught in the middle. Their 1991 album Ceremony was a commercial disappointment compared to what came before. It was an album born from tension, with Astbury and Duffy reportedly so at odds they were rarely in the studio at the same time. They weren't the post-punk goths of their early days, and they certainly weren't the hard rock titans of the late 80s anymore. They just fell out of time and out of touch. On top of that, they went into serious debt on the tour to promote the album, and as a result, the band had to fire their manager. Then came the lawsuits, 3 to be exact. One was from the kid on the cover of the Ceremony album, whose family filed a $61 million lawsuit against the band, claiming the photo they used was not properly cleared. Then there was their former management team and ex-drummer Les Warner, who also sued the band. Now keep in mind, by 1994, only one of the lawsuits had been resolved, according to an interview they gave to the Hamilton Spectator. The resulting issues with their business side led to the band taking some time off by early 1993, but they did find some time to release the greatest hits album Pure Cult. The first week of release, the album actually topped the British charts and eventually went double platinum. Duffy reflected on the changing musical landscape and their business issues, telling the Hamilton Spectator, "There's only so much space around for popular music, and Pearl Jam and bands like them had a lot to say. They were really creative, and it just seemed like the natural order of things for us to step aside and take care of our own private business." He added, "We kept writing songs after 1991 Ceremony, but it was tarnished. It was a pretty unhappy time. Ceremony was like the end of an era. We realized we had to come to a place where we were going to have to change." Now, things had gotten so bad between Duffy and Astbury that they wouldn't even interact unless it was absolutely necessary, and they even traveled in separate tour buses. But then the band got an offer to open for Guns N' Roses in Europe in the summer of 1993. It was a funny offer given that Guns N' Roses had actually opened for the Cult back in 1987. But the band agreed and went on tour, and that trek provided the spark for a return of the Cult. In this new world, they had a choice: fade away or reinvent themselves completely. They chose Reinvention. The plan was to create something that would fit the new world order, an album that was raw, honest, and stripped of all that 80s excess. They even decided to self-title it, a classic move that signals a definitive statement, perhaps a rebirth. This was going to be the real Cult. Now, one critic later painted the record that they were about to make as a harsh, bruised-sounding album that could only have come out in 1994, soaked in the grim grunge mood of the time, rather than the glossy excess of their 80s peak. For this reinvention, they turned to a familiar face, producer Bob Rock. Now, even though he was the guy who gave Sonic Temple its polished stadium-sized sound, they had no intention of actually repeating the past. In fact, back in a 1989 interview, Billy Duffy had said they'd probably never work with Rock again. But this time the mission was Well, it was different. They gathered at the Warehouse Studios in Vancouver, not to build another monument to the rock bombast, but to tear the whole thing down. As Astbury later put it, the philosophy was to destroy everything, tear it all down, set it on fire, get rid of it all, starting right from the beginning again. He talked about treating it like the first record from a brand new band, not a legacy act cashing in on past glories or taking advantage of the latest trend. Duffy, meanwhile, added to the Hamilton Spectator, "It's more stripped down with a live-ish feel because we didn't rehearse that much." Now, surprisingly, the atmosphere during the recording was solid. After years of lineup changes, the band had locked in with Craig Adams on bass and Scott Garrett on drums, forming what Duffy called a cohesive family after 2 years on the road. Now, this tight-knit unit allowed them to jam out songs in pre-production, capturing a raw, spontaneous energy. Bob Rock, meanwhile, became even more than just a producer. He was practically a session musician, laying down bass and guitar tracks. But the biggest shift came from Ian Astbury himself. He turned his lyrics inward, crafting what he called a collection of very personal and very revealing songs. The subject matter was raw and unflinching, touching on the abuse he experienced as a teenager, the death of former Cult drummer Nigel Preston, and his aimless youth in Glasgow. This wasn't the mystical shamanistic poetry of love or the fiery proclamations of electric. This was brutal honesty with no safety net. The frontman was deliberately shedding his larger-than-life rock god persona, and he said he was moving away from trying to define the band and getting back to pure instinct, much like they had on their breakout album Love. He added, "I'd say the volatility of the Cult, that sense of falling apart at any time, is gone now." Famous last words. Now, Duffy, meanwhile, was focused on navigating this new musical landscape. He acknowledged that the influence of grunge was definitely there, but he was adamant that the band was not chasing trends. But reviewers later pointed out that these stripped-down riffs and groove-first arrangements made it easy to hear the echoes of the alternative bands who were ruling the charts at the time, even if the Cult insisted they were following their own instincts. The goal was to update their sound for the 90s, to feel contemporary without being a carbon copy of what was on radio. The result was a sound that was drier, more cerebral, and more rhythm-driven, with Duffy's signature guitar riffs often taking a backseat to mood and texture. Before the album's release, the band felt pretty confident.
We've played the record to a lot of people, friends of ours, people whose opinions we trust, and I suspect, without wanting to sound too confident, that it probably will get a lot of good reviews. And I believe that, you can never tell how the public are going to get it, but I think critically it might well be well received. And I think that it's really strong. It's one of our strongest collection of songs ever. I think of any album we've ever made. I think, but to put it all into one word, it'd have to be just like genius.
I guess that's the whole theme of the record. Is it's just really honest, truthful statement of where we're at right now. With not trying to jump on any fashion bandwagons or sonic bandwagons or whatever. We're just at a place where we're really comfortable with our own songwriting and our own identities and everything.
They believed that they had threaded the needle, creating an album that was both authentic to them and relevant to the times. They had no idea they'd missed the mark so completely, at least in their fans' and critics' eyes. The album that emerged from those Vancouver sessions was stark, challenging, and at times brilliant. It kicks off with Gone, a track that immediately signals this isn't the same old Cult. It's aggressive and raw, a far cry from the anthemic hooks fans had come to expect. Some critics describe Gone as a jagged, disorienting opener, not an obvious single, but a song that reveals its power once you get used to how deliberately off-kilter it feels.
Patience left, your shattered little self.
Astbury told the Province newspaper, "A lot of people have said that Gone is profane. I say, oh God, how boring. It's a release. Gone is about letting go. So we decided to put it all up front." Then you had Star, the album's probably most accessible track and one of its official singles. Interestingly, the song had been kicking around since the Sonic Temple sessions in different forms, at one point even being called Tom Petty. Here it was reworked into a driving anthemic rocker that felt most like a classic Cult song, but it was still wrapped in the grittier production of the new era. It was a quick flash of familiarity on an album that was dead set on defying expectations. But maybe the best example of the album's new direction is Black Sun. The song is a dark, quiet, brooding piece that directly addresses Astbury's experience with abuse. The instruments are minimal, stripped down, evoking the sparse, dynamic arrangements
in this show, this
of
pure
bands like
cult that we're
Soundgarden
presenting
and Pearl
for you.
Jam. Some
An
critics
hour of
even
our
claim
finest
to have heard
moments.
shades of Soundgarden's
So,
softer,
we've seen
super
Sanctuary,
unknown
that
track
was
Hit,
him in
with
the light
Ian
out.
laying out the story over bare instrumentation before the song finally erupts. It's the perfect example of the album's vulnerable, cerebral approach. Another track, Joy, showcased their experimental side. It has a trippy late 60s Doors atmosphere mixed with a kind of rock confessional edge you'd maybe hear in a John Lennon solo song. Astbury himself admitted that the album's lyrics were both sincere and, in his words, offensive, maybe sensing they wouldn't quite land in the cultural climate of 1994. Together, these songs painted a picture of a band in deep introspection. The album cover, a photo of a black Manx log-tanned sheep, was the perfect visual. The album was the band's own black sheep, an outlier in their discography. Among the diehard fans of the band, it's still nicknamed the GOAT album, with some people now championing it as their favorite, precisely because it's so awkward, intense, and out of step with everything around it. The band, in doing press for the album, stressed how they'd since cleaned up their acts, both professionally and personally. Ian was now married, had a son, and even penned a new song on the record to his current wife called Real Girl. The frontman was more forthcoming, admitting that between the ages of 25 and 28, he drank like a psycho, in his own words, adding, "It was crazy. No matter how much we messed up, we still had success. They wanted to put me on the front cover of Vogue." The Cult's self-titled album was released in early October of 1994, and it landed with a deafening thud. The bold artistic pivot that felt so vital in the studio was met with what can only be described as commercial indifference. The album stalled at a disappointing number 69 in the US and number 21 in the UK. The band that had once sold millions of records and filled arenas was now on the commercial sidelines. The reasons were painfully clear. The musical landscape hadn't just shifted, it had completely transformed. The Cult's new sound, while influenced by the alternative scene, didn't really belong to it. They weren't grunge, they weren't Britpop, and they sure weren't the hard rock band they used to be. They were adrift, and their new cerebral style failed to connect with old fans who wanted the stadium rock of Sonic Temple, while also failing to grab a new audience that was already loyal to the bands from Seattle or Manchester. As Billy Duffy had noted, we've always been very ahead or very behind. We've never been attached to fashion. But this time, being out of fashion proved to be fatal. The label strategy didn't help much either. In some markets, Coming Down was pushed out first, a droning, almost U2-ish song that sounded nothing like Firewoman or Love Removal Machine. A few reviewers liked it, but for a lot of fans, it was a confusing introduction to this new version of the Cult. The single Coming Down was the only charting single in the States, peaking at number 13 and 26 on the mainstream and alternative rock charts. The band that had once been an MTV staple soon found themselves almost getting no airplay. The reviews, meanwhile, were divisive. Some critics praised the album's daring reinvention, while others dismissed it as a failed attempt to stay relevant. But over time, a subset of fans and writers have come around, calling it one of those records that only really clicks after repeated listens, and arguing that it's more adventurous than it ever got credit for. But critical respect doesn't pay the bills or fill seats. The raw personal album they had poured themselves into was met with not anger, but with a quiet collective shrug from the public. For a band used to being huge, that silence proved to be devastating. The commercial failure of the self-titled album poured gasoline on the dying embers of the old tensions between Ian Astbury and Billy Duffy. The Black Rain tour meant to support the album quickly became a rolling disaster. One article at the time described the self-titled record as a kind of tug-of-war between them, with Astbury more enthusiastic about the new direction and Duffy far less convinced, echoing the creative split they'd already gone through around the time of Ceremony. The lack of public interest combined with the internal pressures created a powder keg. The breaking point finally came in the spring of 1995 during the tour's South American leg. After a show in Rio de Janeiro in March, the whole thing just fell apart.
As the band hit the road to tour, Ian began drinking again after almost 3 years of sobriety. And in March of '95, after a concert in Brazil, everything fell to pieces.
I just think something inside him snapped. He just was like, I'm done with this.
I was drunk and emotional one night, and, it was basically sort of like a cat fight.
Suddenly Ian just went mad, punched me, kicked somebody else, threw a couple of tables over. I said, that's it, I've had enough, bastards, And we thought he was like, we'll be fine, we'll let him have a bit of time to himself, and got up the next morning, gone.
The rest of the tour dates were scrapped, and as Billy Duffy simply put it, Ian just split. It wasn't a mutual decision or a planned hiatus. It was a sudden, unceremonious implosion. The reasons were complex, rooted in years of creative friction and personal struggles. Duffy later reflected that a core issue was their shared discomfort with fame, stating, "I think the problem was that neither of us ever felt very comfortable with success. We're just not cut out for being pop stars." For Ian, the toll was even more profound. He cited sheer exhaustion after more than a decade with the band, his struggles with substance abuse, and a breakdown of his marriage. He felt the artistic and personal sacrifices had just become too much, revealing, "I left the band because I was exhausted after 12 years with Duffy. I had given everything. For too long, I went without fighting for my musical voice to be heard." He was also completely disillusioned with the state of rock music. The grunge movement had killed the peacock frontman persona he had once perfected, and this new dressed-down era he felt like a relic. The ambitious, vulnerable album that was supposed to be a rebirth had instead become the final nail in the coffin. The gamble had failed, and the partnership at the heart of the cult was now broken, seemingly for good. In the aftermath, Astbury moved on to with the group The Holy Barbarians before also putting out a solo record. Duffy, meanwhile, played with Mike Peters from The Alarm in the group Color Sound.
The cult become more about lifestyle and business than it was about art. It was about music. And to me, the cult in some respects stopped being a band when Nigel Preston left. That's when we were really a band. It was Jamie, Nigel, me and Billy. That was a long time ago, music again. Whereas Billy, I think, maybe, I don't know, seemed to be less open-minded to doing very progressive things, maybe a little bit afraid of doing it. So, I hope he does well in whatever he's doing.
Duffy told Louder Sound about his relationship with the cult's frontman. "Me and Ian barely saw each other in that period. From 1995 to 1999, I literally saw him probably once or twice a year casually somewhere. That was the reality of what it was like. We were on two different paths." The cult went silent for 4 years. It took the persistent efforts, though, of friends and former bandmates to even get Billy Duffy and Ian Astbury talking again. Finally, in 1999, the band reformed, eventually releasing Beyond Good and Evil in 2001. And in a wild west of irony, they teamed up again with Bob Rock, but this time they went back to a full-throttle hard rock sound, almost a direct rejection of the 1994 experiment. They signed their biggest label deal of their career at the time, but the Beyond Good and Evil period ended with the band breaking up once again. That's a story for another time. Today, the cult's self-titled album stands as a unique, poignant chapter in the band's story. It's often overlooked even by the band themselves, with only a few songs occasionally showing up on their live sets. The album is a brutally honest artifact of its time, a time when a band built on swagger tried to find its footing in a world that has suddenly embraced minimalism. It's the sound of two creative partners pulling in different directions, only to find themselves totally alone when they got there. The album's failure directly caused their multi-year disappearance, a commercial and spiritual blow that took them years to recover from. And yet, looking back, it has a strange and compelling power. In its raw, cerebral, and deeply personal songs, it contains some of the most sincere and daring work they've ever produced. It may have been the album that caused them to disappear for almost half a decade, but it's also a testament to their unwillingness to ever stand still, even when that meant walking straight off a cliff. That brings us to the end of today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again in Rock Culture Stories. Take care.